Hi, everybody, and welcome to this podcast where I'm going to discuss the Paramedic Council proposed registration consultation document. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Mark Garner, and I am an intensive care paramedic with St John in Auckland. I've been a paramedic for 27 years, and I've worked in Auckland and in Hawke's Bay. I've also worked in Australia offshore and remotely. And I also taught for 3 years in the Bachelor of Health Science undergraduate program at AUT. I have the undergraduate and postgraduate diploma of advanced resus from AUT, and I also have a Bachelor of Commerce majoring in commercial law and management. So that's me. I don't claim to be an expert on this particular field or document. These are my personal opinions, not that of my employer or anyone else. But the whole idea of this podcast is to stimulate debate and hopefully clarify some of the issues around paramedic registration and the document, and to encourage you all to provide your feedback on the consultation process, because I think it's very important. So let's go to the document. So the Health Practitioners Competence Assurance Act is the piece of legislation in New Zealand that gives rise to paramedic registration. And the whole idea of the Act is to protect the health and safety of members of the public by ensuring that those people that do practice paramedicine or any of the qualifications or professionals listed under the Act, that they have the right qualifications and are competent and fit to practice. So as of 1st of January 2020 this year, an executive order was added to the Health Practitioners Competence Assurance Act, which designated paramedic services as health professionals. And so we now fall under that act. It also gave rise to a Paramedic Council, which has recently been formed, and they will oversee the registration process. A little legal anomaly to do with this is that obviously under the Health Practitioners Competence Assurance Act, you're required to have registration and a current practicing certificate to practice paramedicine, but obviously the council's only just been formed and we don't have registration or practicing certificates. So technically speaking, we're actually all working illegally, but obviously no one's going to prosecute us. Also, a little legal anomaly is the fact that the term paramedic isn't actually defined in the law in New Zealand. Now, in law, if you don't define a term, what tends to happen is that law goes and looks at a legal the dictionary definition of that term. So if we were to do that under the Cambridge Dictionary, the term paramedic is very broad. They list it as a person who's trained to do medical work, especially in an emergency, but who's not a doctor or a nurse. Similarly, in the Collins Dictionary, they say a paramedic is a person who's trained similar to that of a nurse and who helps to do medical work. So these definitions are very broad. Even Black's Law Dictionary says a person whose authority and appropriate training required to provide emergency medical help. These are very broad definitions, and the trouble with that is that those definitions can capture pretty much everyone who works in the pre-hospital field, and that includes a firefighter who's been trained how to do CPR and goes in to do CPR, includes an EMA who's trained to do basic first aid in the pre-hospital environment, obviously includes EMTs, paramedics, ICPs, everybody. And I know the council's intention is only to register paramedics and above, but because there's no legal definition for the term paramedic, at the moment as it stands, this is my understanding, is that everyone is captured by that term. And so if paramedics are to be registered, technically speaking, that includes all these people as well. I don't know how they're going to get around that, or whether they're going to form a legal definition of the term paramedicine, but and I have spoken to a lawyer about this, but it would appear that everybody, all these people, are captured by the term paramedic under that Act. If we go to the document, turn that one off, turn this one on. So we talked about the health practitioner's designation. This is the Paramedic Council's document. So the Paramedic Council was formed earlier this year, and there's a number of members who are paramedics on that council. I'm personally very happy with the people that were chosen for that council. I think they'll do a fantastic job in representing us, and I think they'll do a fair and equitable job in the whole registration process. Now, they are required under the HPCA Act to consult with the industry on the registration process before they actually formalise it. And so they have released this document on the 12th of August, asking for your feedback. So this is what the document proposes the registration process looks like, the qualifications required, etc. But they need your feedback before they can actually formalise it. And the closing date for that feedback is the 16th of September. We will talk about how to provide that feedback. The document itself talks about the proposed scopes of practice that they're putting forward, and also the qualifications that you'll need in order to be able to become registered. Now, please take note that this is a proposal. This isn't written in hard ink at the moment. This is what they're proposing, and they need your say on whether they should go ahead like this or what they should change. Also, something to consider is, having spoken to council members, they actually inherited this document from the Paramedic Council working group. So it wasn't actually the council themselves that came up with this. It was a working group of industry bodies, of tertiary providers, of paramedics, etc., that were on the committee, government representatives as well. And they put forth this document as a basis for consultation. So please don't say the council's trying to wave a stick. This is just what they've inherited, and they are very much asking for your feedback on it. So if we go through to it, I think it's important to look at these sections that I've highlighted. So the council is actually required by law to look at what qualifications are necessary in order to become a paramedic that would protect the public. But looking at these qualifications, they can't be unnecessarily restrictive on those people being registered, which is interesting. And also, they can't impose undue costs on health practitioners, which is also great. So we'll look at further at what they're proposing in those regards. So to be registered, you will be required to have some form of qualification, and there are 5 ways that you can qualify, essentially, for whatever that qualification may be. So this is what they're proposing. You either have a degree or a diploma that they recognise from a recognised educational institution. Now, again, it's my understanding that the committee has yet to actually tick off or accredit tertiary education providers that meet their requirements. So the tertiary providers, FITAREA or AUT or whoever it might be, actually have to go through a process of sign-off to be accredited, and I don't believe that's happened yet. But anyway, so if you have a degree or diploma, then they're saying that you will meet the requirement. If you don't have a degree or diploma, but you've successfully completed some course of study or program that they say is accredited, then you'll also meet that requirement. If you don't have those qualifications, but you've specified some sort of examination or other assessment that they set, you'll also meet the requirement. If you don't have those qualifications from a New Zealand provider, but you have an overseas registration, then you can use that to tick off your qualification requirement. And finally, if you don't have any degree or qualification, formal qualification, but you do have experience operating at a certain ATP, then they may actually use that as well. So that's quite a very broad range of things that you can do to tick off the required qualification. This is in year one. Subsequent years, they're going to require you to have a degree, but at the moment, for this first year of registration, as long as you follow one of those areas, one of those 5 things, then they're saying that you will tick the requirement for qualification. So this is quite interesting, section 9. Once you're registered within a scope of practice, and we'll talk about the scopes of practice, and you have obtained an annual practicing certificate, then you will be legally required to practice within that scope of practice in which you're registered. And practicing outside the scope may be grounds for professional discipline. So I thought this was interesting because if you are a paramedic and you are doing the ICP internship, but you're registered as a paramedic and you're not registered as an intensive care paramedic, according to this section, you actually be breaking the law, and there'll be grounds for deregistering you. So I have no idea how that's going to work. That's something that would have to be clarified. I think that'd be worth asking the council for clarification around. Would you get a provisional registration at a higher ATP? I don't know. I don't know how that works. It's something to be aware of. So the council is proposing 2 different scopes of practice. Paramedic as the base one, and then for those that want to practice as ICPs or ECPs, you'll have to also be registered as a paramedic specialist. So they are looking at 2 tiers of registration. In contrast, Australia only has 1 tier of registration, and that's paramedic. So it doesn't matter what your ATP is, you're a paramedic, you get registered as a paramedic. So I don't know, do you think that's a good idea, having a 2-tier system, or do you think we should just have a 1-tier system? They're looking for your feedback. So please feedback what you consider would be the best way forward. Personally, I quite like the idea of having 2 different registration authorities, but that's just my opinion. So in order to become registered, they're saying in the first year of registration, there'll be 3 different pathways you can approach in order to qualify for registration. So the first pathway is to complete a tertiary qualification, and it talks later in the document about what that is. They're looking for people to have the Bachelor of Health Science in Paramedicine. So after year 1, you'll have to have the paramedic degree to become registered. At the moment, they're just saying a tertiary qualification in paramedicine. So that may be a diploma, that may be the Bachelor of Health Science. If you don't have that, as long as you have pathway B is to have passed a council-approved registration assessment program, RAP. So I understand from talking to the council members that they do want to register everybody who has a current ATP at the ATP level that they're practicing at. That's their intention. And I guess this would be one way of doing that. If you've passed some sort of assessment within the last 2 years of before registration happens, if registration happens next year, if you've passed whatever their assessment program is, then you will meet the criteria for registration. The third pathway is to submit a portfolio of evidence of your paramedic experience. So if you don't have a formal qualification, you can put forward a portfolio of evidence, and then you'll also still have to potentially complete some sort of examination or assessment. There might be a CAD day, that might be an exam that they set. I don't know. They haven't actually clarified what that looks like, or who that's with, or what that process is, so that would be something I would be asking them to clarify. But with these 3 pathways, potentially we should be able to get pretty much anyone who has an ATP registered, which is great. So it's not really constrictive. I don't think we need to be fearful of it. And like I say, having spoken to the council members, it's their intention that everybody who's practicing at the current ATP will be registered at the ATP. Another little thing to just be aware of is that there will be requirements to be able to demonstrate effective and respectful interaction with Maori. So for everyone that's going for registration, you'll have to do some sort of an online education program prior to applying for registration. Now, again, having spoken to the council members, they put forward the program they were talking about, and it's an online, interactive online learning session. It's absolutely free, and it talks about cultural competency. And I did it today. I thought it was really good. I think I've learned some things from it. A good reminder of the requirement of our language that we use when it comes to different cultures. So I think it's actually worthwhile doing, and I would encourage people to do it anyway, even before registration, because I think it does help our practice. I think it's a good thing to do. Another thing to note here is that they're proposing that after the first year of registration, only pathway A will be available, so you'll have to have the Bachelor of Health Science Paramedicine to become registered after year one. So they talk more about the pathways here, which is really just what I've talked about. They do refer to AUT and Whitireia as the people who would be setting some sort of assessment or CAD day or exam, or they hint here about it being the final clinical exam and the final year paramedic students required to pass their degree. I don't know how that would work, because it depends what papers you're doing in your final year, but maybe ask for clarification around that. Interesting. For people that want to become registered at ICP or ECP, then there's an additional pathway that you'll have to go down. So what they are suggesting in the document is for ICP or ECP that you have to have a relevant postgraduate qualification. So as well as having the Bachelor of Health Science, you'll have to have a postgraduate qualification, or alternatively have passed some sort of RAP in the previous 2 years before registration. So that's quite narrow, that requirement. And also the postgraduate qualification I'm talking about is actually the postgraduate diploma. So that's a 120-point qualification, and that takes 2 years part-time usually to complete. So it isn't cheap. So, but this is the bar they're sort of proposing to set if we do have a two-tiered registration system. So, what do you think of that? Should it be a postgraduate diploma? Should it just be the 2 ICP papers that St. John make you do at the moment? Should that be sufficient? They do say that will be one of the ways that you can get it, but you have to have done them within 2 years of registration. So if registration doesn't come in until next year, you would have had to have done those papers last year or this year, and if it doesn't come in until the year after, you will have to have done those papers this year and next year. So yeah, interesting. Or perhaps you'll have to pass some sort of CAD day or exam or something. I don't know. What do you think of that? It's something to think about. So if you go further down the document, they actually talk about this stuff. There's also section 16 of the Act they talk about, which requires you to be demonstrate that you meet the requirements of section 16, and section 16 talks about things like that you can communicate effectively and that you can communicate and comprehend English sufficiently. I'm not sure how we prove we do that, but you'll have to prove it somehow. It might just be through an affidavit. We did registered in Australia, and we actually had to prove that, but I can't actually remember. I think it was just ticking some boxes. We might have had to get a affidavit, a sworn affidavit, or a JP signed off form or something. I can't remember. You also can't have been convicted in a court of New Zealand or anywhere else for an offence punishable by a term of 3 months imprisonment or longer. Now, it doesn't mean if you have committed some sort of offence that you did time of 3 months or longer. It's just the offence has to have been punishable by up to 3 months or longer imprisonment. So, if, for example, you got caught drunk driving and you didn't get 3 months, you lost your license, but you didn't actually get any prison time, but the offence was punishable by prison time of 3 months or longer, then potentially that could stop you from being registered. So that's something to be aware of. Section D, the council has to be satisfied that you're able to perform the functions required. And if you can't because of some mental or physical condition, then that could also interfere with your registration application. So I know of at least one paramedic who has a prosthetic leg and is practicing fine, but this could stop that. I don't know. It would be interesting to ask for clarification around that, maybe. E, F, and G is also interesting. So they talk about being subject to some professional disciplinary proceedings. Now, if you've been accused of something and you are under investigation for that, and you're subsequently found not guilty of it, just being the fact that you're under an investigation for it could be enough to stop you from being registered. So again, that's interesting. I'm not sure that I agree with that section. I understand why they put it in there, but you should be innocent until proven guilty. Whereas here they're saying even if you've been investigated, that could be grounds for not meeting the requirement for registration. Something to think about. So they have a diagram here of the different pathways that you can take if you're overseas registered, and you can apply for Trans-Tasman recognition of the Trans-Tasman pathway. Thing to note there is even if you are registered in Australia and New Zealand does go for the two-tiered registration system, that will only get you paramedic registration. So if you're an ICP but you're registered in Australia, they don't have ICP, they just have one level of registration, paramedic. You can cross-credit that one, but you'll also still have to apply for ICP registration in New Zealand, so on top of that. And I think it was they're talking about fees of $420 just to be apply for that Trans-Tasman recognition, so not cheap. Here they're talking about having the Bachelor of Health Science in Paramedicine as the qualification that require you to have, or you've done some sort of RAP assessment in the last 2 years. Or the other pathway was a portfolio of evidence. For ICPs, their pathway here stipulates that you have to have a postgraduate diploma in advanced resuscitation, or a postgraduate diploma in health science. So it has to be a 120-point postgraduate qualification in CCP or ICP, or ECP if you're going for ECP registration. Alternatively, you've passed some sort of assessment in the last 2 years. So it could be that you've just done the 2 ICP papers, but unless you've done it in the last 2 years, they won't count according to this process. So that's something to clarify with them. I'm not sure I agree with that process, but I do have the postgraduate diploma, so it doesn't bother me particularly. One thing to note there is, I understand, and I'm happy to be corrected here, but the postgraduate diploma, AUT teachers anyway, doesn't currently include advanced resuscitation, I don't believe. And I know St. John is, in the future, going to require ICPs to be RSI trained, and the advanced resuscitation paper is the paper that you learn that in. So that's going to be interesting, because they're saying you can be an ICP if you have the postgraduate diploma, but St. John's saying no, you need the RSI paper to have ATP at that level. So, yeah, interesting what will happen there, but that's something to be aware of. They list the paramedic scope of practice. Again, it's very broad. It doesn't actually say what skills you have, but this definition that they have is so broad that would incorporate an EMT, potentially an EMA. It doesn't actually designate the skill sets, which I thought was interesting. And then they go on about the different pathways you can get paramedic registration. And also for a specialist scope of practice, again, quite broad, not very specific to the skill sets that we currently have. And they talk about the different ways that you can get that. So there's the postgraduate diploma or the 2 papers in the last 2 years. This is interesting. The council is mindful of existing measures in place that have supported the paramedic profession. So this is where they're saying, look, we do want people that are practicing at the current ATP to be registered at ATP. And that is their intention. So don't stress if you don't have those qualifications or you haven't done postgraduate qualifications. Having spoken to the council members, it does appear to be their intention to register people at the current ATP. So that's that document. If we go back to the browser here, I just wanted to... This is the paramediccouncil.org.nz website. If you click on consultations, the consultations tab, there's actually some links to a survey that they've put out, Scopes of Practice and Qualification Survey and the Fees Survey. So these are surveys that you can undertake to provide your feedback. And at the end of the survey, there's also a link there for an email address that you can email them directly. So please make sure that you go to the paramediccouncil.org.nz website and click on these surveys and provide your feedback. It's very important because that's what they'll be using to formulate the whole registration process. The other thing I just want to talk about was the fees. So if we go back to this one. So Paramedic Council fees. This is another document that proposed that talk about the fees. So again, they're required to consult you about the fees. They're basing their fees on their operating expenses, proposed operating expenses, which include these things here. And they're proposing that the annual practicing certificate fee, which is your annual cost, so you get registration, you pay for that, that's a one-off cost. Then every year you have to get an annual practicing certificate. They are proposing that it'll be $600, and that will include a disciplinary levy of $45. I don't know what that disciplinary level means. I'm asking for clarification. I suggest you do as well. But that's what they're talking about. They have a table that benchmarks the fees they're proposing against other allied health professionals. And I believe they are talking about registering around about 1,000 paramedics in New Zealand. So if you look at a equivalent allied health professional optometrist board, it's kind of within QE of what they're charging. So they have a registration fee of $265. Ours would be $200, or if you're an ICP, it'll be $400. And annual practicing certificate for them is $747, and they're talking about $600. So it is kind of benchmarked against allied health professionals. So the international registration fee will be $200. They're talking about an annual practicing certificate of $600. Now, just be aware, I know in Australia this has gone up already. Every year this goes up, at least by CPI. Often the Australia went up by double CPI. So just be aware of that. And if you are an ICP or an ECP, you have an extra registration fee, proposed registration fee of $200, so it'll be $1,000. Now, I know that under the current wage negotiations, it was proposed to put in there that St. John cover the cost of registration. And I think I suggest you talk to your union delegate, because if your employer does cover the registration fee, that might only be the initial registration fee and not your annual practicing certificate. So please make sure that you clarify with them what your employer will actually reimburse. And also for those that are working casually or part-time, there's Are you included in that as far as the wage negotiation goes? In the past, that hasn't been the case. Often casual people, staff have missed out. So that would be worth clarifying with your union delegates while we're in negotiation. Just some other things I'll talk about just briefly before winding up. Just turn this one off. So in Australia, with the Australian registration, we got sent an email by them talking about how part of the requirement to be registered is a suitable person's requirement, and they talk specifically about things like making Facebook comments or comments on social media, even in your personal capacity. Once you're a registered healthcare professional, if someone took offence to your point of view on something, they could bring that to the council's attention, and if it was decided that it was outlandish enough, potentially that could affect your registration. So that's something I think a lot of people don't realise, that once you're a registered healthcare professional, even when you're off duty, even in your personal capacity, you're still being watched, and it could affect your registration. I think that's pretty much it. I think I've covered everything off. Like I say, these are just my personal views, my personal opinions. If you have anything to add, please feel free to leave some comments. I hope it's been of help to you, and let's get on this together. Make sure you give your feedback, and hopefully registration will happen in the near future. Thanks for listening. Bye.